Although you all already know him, because unless you've really just snuck in here, he's been emailing you and communicating with you as we've prepared for this. Brian Just serves as the Event and Executive Services Manager at the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity and is Managing Editor of the journal Ethics in Medicine. Brian is pursuing a PhD in Church History here at Trinity. He has MAs in Church History and Theological Studies. And for those of you who were here last year, you'll recall that he wrote his master's thesis on the history of the center and its place within evangelical bioethics. He's also interested in evangelicalism, church history, and the history of bioethics. His wife, Rebecca, is back at the registration table. She's been one of our volunteers. She works over in the business office here at Trinity wearing many, many hats. They are eagerly looking forward to the birth of their first child in October. And I really hope that you know how much I appreciate Brian, how hard he works, and how much he does to pull this off. So Brian, come and introduce Michael.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being here. This conference wouldn't be possible without attendees. It would be very lonely just standing here talking to an empty room. As we move to our concluding session of the conference, we will go straight through from Dr. Sleasman's talk into the Matthew's farewell and dismissal. But if you have any questions for Dr. Sleasman, he too will be around afterwards to talk to you, to greet you, and to discuss his presentation. Though our final speaker of this afternoon needs, I think, very little introduction from me, Dr. Michael Sleasman has a long history with the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, serving for 12 years as the center's managing director and research scholar before transitioning to his current position as director of bioethics degree programs for Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, CBHD's parent institution. He also serves as the editor of Ethics in Medicine, an international journal of bioethics. Dr. Sleasman completed his doctorate in theological studies with a concentration in systematic theology right here at TEDS. His areas of research specialization include the theological engagement of bioethical issues with particular emphasis on biotechnology, other emerging technologies, and human futures, as well as the intersection of technology, ethics, and culture. In addition to his extensive writing for CBHD, Dr. Sleasman is the co-editor of Everyday Theology, How to Read Cultural Texts and Interpret Trends with Kevin Van Hooser and Charles Anderson. He's published numerous essays, book chapters, articles, and book reviews in the areas of theology, bioethics, and technology, including contributing the entry on bioethics to the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology and the entries on nanotechnology and robots to the Encyclopedia of Global Bioethics. I've had the privilege of working for Dr. Sleasman for 8 years now. The first 4 were as his research assistant here at the center, and I was quite disappointed when I found out that he would be moving to the degree program and I would not be reporting to him any longer. Not any slight against Matthew, he's also been wonderful to work with. But I was going to miss him. So when I found out that he had taken on the editorial role at Ethics in Medicine, I asked if I could jump over as the managing editor there, because he can't get rid of me that easily. Dr. Sleasman's been much more than a boss. He has been a mentor, both academically and personally. He has and continues to shape my thinking on theology and bioethics. It seems there's never a topic I can raise that he hasn't thought through to some extent or can't recommend a book on. I've seen firsthand his care for students, even those who aren't taking his classes, and his passion for shaping the next generation of bioethicists. When I first started at the center, Mike would often say that he was a theologian, not a bioethicist. However, now that he is in the degree program, I think he has finally accepted that he deserves the title of bioethicist, although he will still refer to himself as the accidental bioethicist. Accidental or not, I have always been impressed with his breadth of knowledge and ability to think through the ethical implications of our technology-filled world, and I can think of no one better to close our conference this afternoon. Please welcome Dr. Michael Sleasman.
Thank you, Brian. You know you've reached a point in your career when people who have been in student roles are suddenly introducing you at conferences, right? Well, thank you and good afternoon. I was thinking yesterday during Matthew Anderson's session when he was speaking about some plagiarism that you might be detecting in his paper and how all of us as scholars in some ways build on the work of others, and our scholarship is really a footnote. And so I was thinking, well, maybe it would be fun if I put an opportunity out to my students that if you could detect all of the references, count them up, and send me the correct number, maybe you would get extra credit. But then, as I was looking through the paper, I was realizing this is going to be way too many, and I don't even want to count this up, so don't do that, okay? 2 days ago, we embarked together on a journey of reflection and analysis to examine the future of health, faith ethics, and our MedTech world. For our final session this afternoon, I've been asked to help us land the plane, as it were, to help us take what we have been engaging over the last few days and frame next steps as to what our engagement of these issues might look like going forward, both in our bioethical scholarship, but also in our everyday lives. In other words, in light of all of the opportunities and challenges before us in this world of increasingly sophisticated medical, scientific, and technological capabilities, to invoke the words of our Christian forebears of a generation ago, how then should we live? In this regard, I'm grateful for the excellent work of Dr. Epinet and the team here at CBHD in organizing, once again, a superb lineup of speakers and topics. And I'm also grateful to the other plenary speakers themselves for all of their excellent work in stimulating presentations. Through their careful descriptions, insightful analyses, powerful critiques, they have helped us to diagnose and understand the challenges and opportunities of the times in which we find ourselves. My goals for this remaining session are a bit more modest. As we pause to gather ourselves before disbanding from our gathering and returning to our individual lives and spheres of influence, where might our thoughts and engagement be best directed in light of what we've examined here this weekend? And specifically, the question I have standing in the forefront of my mind is, what at the end of the day does a Christian Hippocratic approach to these issues have to offer in light of the various challenges and opportunities that have been discussed? As my students will regularly attest to hearing in my classes, critique is the easiest form of engagement. The real work, the real challenge at the end of the day, is not in saying what you are against, but rather in constructively setting forth a vision of what you are for. Tearing things down is always much easier than building something up and building a positive contribution. Far too often, this has been a challenge for Christian bioethics. We are good at saying no to things, but we're not all that great, and sometimes we forget to do the task of saying yes. What at the end of the day are we actually for? In our advocacy on behalf of life, we sometimes forget about promoting life and not merely preventing unnatural death, or our rhetoric is easily reduced to being merely against a culture of death. A Christian Hippocratic perspective, however, should be much more robust than that, a perspective, after all, that finds its identity in a robust biblical worldview and honors the legacy of the Hippocratic tradition in its principled practice of medicine. What might such a perspective add for building a culture of life in this MedTech world? One of the key aspects of this work of engagement, then, is knowing the times, and thus, of course, the work of continuing cultural diagnosis. This task is critical, a work we have been well-equipped for this weekend through the plenary sessions, the various workshops you've been attending, and the parallel papers. And yet, the rapid pace of change demands vigilance, not only assessing the immediate challenges we are experiencing, but also keeping our eyes on the horizon. While Christian Hippocratism is rightfully skeptical of utilitarian-based approaches to ethical analysis, one important tool we must learn better to use in the context of a MedTech world is the role of robust technology assessment. Related skills and risk assessment, threat matrices, and scenario building, all important for the task of properly evaluating emerging technologies. Too often, our Christian bioethical analysis has moved to unlikely scenarios of worst-case outcomes as the only mode of our analysis for thinking about future and emerging technologies. While we also need to be watchful for such catastrophic existential risks, We don't need to always assume that every technological or biotech innovation will bring about the end of the world. Just because something terrible can happen doesn't mean it necessarily will, or that it is even likely that it will. At the same time, however, mere wishful thinking that it will all just work out in the end isn't all that helpful either. So we have to find a middle ground. Furthermore, our future casting should not ignore presenting dilemmas that already exist within the realm of these emerging technologies, in their research, but also in their current application. In our care to watch for the future, we need to find a proper balance then between the far horizon and the near horizon we are already living in. These are both a part of robust engagement of emerging technologies. In the formalized context of emerging tech analysis, there are likewise approaches that are frequently employed that are not all that helpful. In this regard, narrow forms of technology and risk assessment presented within various industries typically focus their analysis on the managerial trifecta of safety, efficiency, effectiveness, and economic input or economic impact, or what we might think of as just revenue generation. However, just as we advocate for a much more robust, informed consent in the clinical context, so too do we need to advocate for more robust, informed decisions in the context of biotech and emerging tech development. In this regard, the work of Henk ten Have, writing specifically for UNESCO in the context of assessing nanotechnologies, may be of some assistance to us. Noting the inadequacy of such approaches of risk assessment, he suggests that we need to take into consideration a broader conception of technology assessment that includes the social and ethical consequences of such technologies. This broader conception, he adds, should include an examination of, quote, the value of judgments at play in such recommendations and determine if and how these recommendations were not simply scientific, but also normative. Ten Have is making an important distinction here, that merely knowing the technical dimensions of things is not sufficient grounds for being able to provide the analyses necessary to determine if we should pursue a technology. Given this, what does informed consent of emerging tech look like in the broader context of our MedTech world? How can we as consumers, the general public, those involved in regulatory and governmental bodies properly assess risk when so little attention is given to the broader social and ethical implications of these technologies that are ubiquitous within our everyday lived experiences? One thinks, for instance, of the emerging literature on the detrimental impact of social media on the developing minds of adolescents, the immense impact it is having on their resilience and specifically their mental health. The book was already mentioned, but strongly I recommend the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation, if this is not something you've begun to explore. While it may be easy to think that simple things like everyday tech use are removed from the realm of bioethics, think again. Haidt's work joins a growing body of research that includes the work of MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle, journalist Nicholas Carr, computer scientist Jaron Lanier, and others raising important questions about the impact of digital technologies, questions related to these technologies and how they are reshaping the way we think, the way we learn, our attention spans, our ability to have sustained thoughts, our emotional states, how we relate to each other, how we conceive of ourselves as human beings, and our health and overall well-being. One thinks of the charge from Jesus to the Pharisees and Sadducees in Matthew 16. Jesus notes that they were good at reading the weather, but blind to seeing the truth of realities happening in their midst. Quote, you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Now hear me, I want to be very careful here. I'm not intending to spiritualize this passage, nor am I intending in any way for you to make a direct connection between developments in the MedTech world and the emergence of eschatological realities. However, this passage comes to mind because, among other things, Jesus was calling them out because they could not see that deeper things were afoot. We too can become adept users and consumers of our MedTech world without ever recognizing that is reshaping us in profound ways, reshaping our understanding of the nature of medicine, as Far Curlin discussed earlier this morning, reshaping our understanding of the self, the body, our minds, and our identity, reshaping our relationships, not only in the way that we relate to each other, think digital communications, but also our understanding of relatedness as such. Indeed, the MedTech world, for better or worse, is reshaping us, reshaping what it means to be human, as several of the sessions explicitly pointed out over the course of this weekend. In light of this reshaping, those of us interested in advancing faithfulness and flourishing amidst the developments of our MedTech world must become more vocal advocates for strong science and tech literacy. The time for hiding our heads in the sand, for throwing our hands up in the air in resignation are over. If you are a participant in a scientifically advanced society, you should have some basic understanding of science. Participants in a technologically sophisticated world should be more than mere button clickers. For far too many, our use of contemporary technologies, contemporary medicine has been at best a form of uncritical consumerism. For these MedTech realities, for many, have become the surrogates of hope. For others, a source of comfort and security. And for some, an escape amidst the suffering and challenges of life. Sci-fi author Arthur C. Clarke famously formulated what have been referred to in later years as his 3 laws about technology and science. Perhaps the most widely cited of these is the following: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If we're being truly honest with ourselves, how many of us would that describe in our understanding of what's happening when we use our devices? Our lack of ability to understand or be able to explain, even at a rudimentary level, what is going on in these technologies, perhaps even more disturbing, our lack of interest or willingness to even learn to do so, leads us easily to misunderstand, misconstrue the things that we are using. We become blind to the reality that, yes, indeed, we do shape the technologies we create, but then they too turn around and shape us. As one might expect, given the diverse background of the American population, research studies suggest that Americans have varying degrees of competence in general scientific knowledge. While a 2017 Pew study suggested 62%, maybe this is encouraging, of US adults had encountered science information in the previous year through some kind of involvement in an educational or other kind of institution. Think zoos, aquariums, museums, science centers, parks. The findings, not surprisingly though, were quite heavily skewed based upon education levels. Furthermore, while 71% reported at least being somewhat interested in science news, only a third of the participants, and actually less than that, reported that they ever actively sought it out. A 2019 follow-up study by Pew sought to measure such science literacy, this time not through self-report, but through a series of knowledge-based questions to assess whether or not the population understood some basic scientific principles or information. The study indicated that Americans could answer just shy of 7 out of 11. Again, maybe that's encouraging to you. But these results varied quite widely with, depending on a number of factors, this time not just education, although that one was significant, also gender, race, ethnicity, and also age. Some of the subpopulations with this study scored as low as 3.7 out of 11. Okay? Less than half that of some of their other higher performing counterparts. 2018 NSF study, report on science and engineering indicators reported similar findings. If we move this to the context of the church, how would you expect that we would fare in such studies? How about in your local congregation, your denomination, the general American Christian subpopulation? And I think if we contextualize this into technology, anecdotally, what might these studies look like in terms of tech literacy with respect to people who could explain some basic understanding of what's going on in their everyday devices? I'm not merely talking about here whether or not we can find the power button, but for some people, that would be a good place to start. The rise of do-it-yourself repair is an interesting phenomenon that we might follow here. As increasing number of individuals in our population are looking to sources like YouTube and other kind of websites, WikiHow and others, to begin to take apart the devices that they have, devices that have broken, and attempting to repair those. Merely opening something gives you an insight in some ways to the reality that this is a something else. Okay? Furthermore, while STEM initiatives have become part and parcel of elementary and secondary education, significant educational movements exist pushing back on the value of such scientific and technological literacy. Now hear me when I say this. To be sure, overemphasizing STEM at the detriment of the humanities, the arts, the social sciences is problematic. So too are STEM approaches that fixate on practical use and testing outcomes by moving way too quickly to the pragmatism of engineering applications and technical problem solving without appropriate emphasis given to the theoretical conceptualization and the location of such pursuits within a broad-based educational paradigm. This needs to be done in the context of an educational model that values all of the domains of learning, all of the domains of education. Likewise, we could speak of the weakness of STEM initiatives that don't incorporate insights from the ELSI discourse, the ethical, legal, and social implications of science and technology as part of their curriculum. And furthermore, despite all of the funding and emphasis in education right now directed to STEM, this does not appear to have made any substantive difference in terms of helping to equip us to be better users and consumers of the MedTech world. Given the context of education, of knowledge and learning, the Delphic maxim, "Nothi sautan," know thyself, seems applicable. Famously identified as one of several philosophical sayings carved over the entrance to the Temple of Apollo in ancient Delphi, this maxim exhorted self-knowledge. Self-knowledge, knowing thyself, takes on increasing importance in our time in which the rapid pace of change, due to all of the technological and medical innovations around us, the continuous stream of scientific developments, they can make our heads spin. It can seem like the ground is continually moving underneath our feet. Whether the ancient Greek thinkers intended the task of knowing ourselves to include also proper knowing and understanding the times we find ourselves in, to locate oneself is a task that seems to be of ever more critical importance. In a world of dynamism and change, it is important to not only know from where we have come, but also where we are and to where we are going. Changing conceptions of medicine and healthcare have led us to the provider of services model that was discussed this morning, where providers and technicians have replaced the professional practitioner in the clinical encounter. Reacting to past excesses of paternalism, we have swung the pendulum to a consumer-driven approach and contractual, patient-centered model that privileges customer preference over actual medical needs and over any real sense of the actual health of the patient. In the tech sector, we continue to blunder ahead with technological innovation under the banner of technological solutionism. All too often, we seem to continue to approach the challenges we encounter in the world with a solutionist mentality, whether it's the reduction of medicalization and its turn to medicine as the answer for all of the world's problems, or medicalization's more sophisticated cousins, genetic determinism, neuroessentialism, or perhaps equally tempting, the technological solutionism, which proffers the answer that more technology is always better technology, and that is what we need. I don't have time to dig into this future, but just point you to the work of people like Evgeny Morozov and his work to save everything, click here. Great book, but it's one of those titles that just always comes back to my mind, truly memorable. As Keith Plummer introduced to us on Thursday evening, we need to open our eyes to the ways in which the cultural practices that attend to these aspects of our culture, our contemporary experience, serves as a means of enculturating us not only into a MedTech world, but also into a MedTech worldview. James Smith has written about the ways in which our everyday practices serve as cultural liturgies that catechize us into various ways of life that, taking a cue from Augustine, direct our affections to ends other than God, and therefore disorder our loves. Smith's volume, You Are What You Love, along with the work of Albert Borgman, is helpful in this regard, and I point you to both of those for further exploration. Is this the way that leads to life? A better life, a life of flourishing and faithfulness. Is it technology? Is it medicine that will lead us there? Certainly, there are advocates of such perspectives. Again, one thinks of another passage from the Gospel of Matthew when John the Baptist is imprisoned and sends his disciples to Jesus, asking, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" That's the sort of mentality it seems we have with these kinds of solutionisms. Now, I want to be careful here again. I'm firmly convinced that the general plight of humanity has improved on the whole as a result of many of the innovations of our MedTech world. My students can attest that I regularly comment in class that while, yes, indeed, there is still injustice and discrimination, the world has its challenges. Indeed, there is immense suffering, there is violence, there's human tragedy, there is crime, there is disease, there's deprivation, humanization, loss, and of course, death is still a problem. But if I had the opportunity to choose to live at any other point in history, I would still choose now. While the top 1% has always lived in luxury, the plight of the 99% has improved. It's certainly better off now, due in part, large part, to the advances in medicine, science, and technology. One thinks of the improvements in general health, in standards of living, in access to food, in clean water. Can more be done? Absolutely. At the same time, however, we are beginning to see some cracks in the visage of the manifest destiny of technological and scientific progress. We are beginning to see signs that the development of the MedTech world has not been an unqualified good. Despite being more connected with more friends than at any point in human history, more people are identifying feelings of isolation and depression, feeling unconnected from each other. This was exacerbated in the midst of the pandemic, which exposed to us that digital communication, virtual communication, is not the same as being together with people. Who knew, after all, that communicating via screen wasn't the same as being in the same room? We need to see the MedTech world for what it is. Part of that task may lead us to examine more closely the sorts of values that are embedded within the various technologies that are an essential part of our MedTech experience. With the rapid acceleration of developments in AI in the last 10 years, but also especially in the last 2 years, much more attention is being given to technological value ladenness, design philosophy, value alignment and tuning, and the examination of embedded values as a whole within these technologies. However, while such conversations are very common within the realm of philosophy of technology, engineering design, and what's referred to as STS, the science, technology, and society discourse, few bioethicists are engaged in such literature or actively seeking to import these types of insights into the domain of bioethical inquiry. Whatever scientific and tech literacy should include from the technical disciplines to help us better understand these technologies as such, there is also an urgent need for the inclusion of more robust models of analysis that take into consideration the sorts of things Henk ten Have had in mind in advocating for a broader conception of technology assessment that we mentioned earlier. This may lead some of us to become more engaged in the realms of philosophy, tech, and STS. Such insights as Don Ide's concept of non-neutral technological mediation, or Jacques Ellul's prophetic description of the totalizing effects of technique in the emergence of the technological society, or the contributions of Neil Postman that were mentioned in several of the sessions. The list could go on. We have been lulled to passivity to an acquiescence of life by the cultural liturgies of our MedTech times. We must awake from this slumbering passivity to begin to responsibly engage with these technologies, with these medical scientific advances in which we are immersed. Think of a talk by Edmund Pellegrino on this very stage some 15 years ago when he exhorted us to move beyond the secondary discourse, the second order discourses in bioethics that attend to the practicalities of our everyday dilemmas that we encounter in the clinic, in the hospital, at the bedside, in our everyday lives. He didn't suggest that those were irrelevant. He thought they were important, but what he wanted to point to is that we needed to do something more. I know he did not use this phrase, but in my notes from that lecture, I wrote down that what he was getting at was we need to stop using Band-Aids as a primary model of bioethical analysis. We need to move on to discuss first-order things, the deeper things. In the interest of the future of health, and in the interest of human flourishing, the lack of attention to these deeper considerations desperately needs to change. Furthermore, from a Christian Hippocratic perspective, there is certainly a whole host of theological and Christian ethical considerations that we could bring to bear. It's here that I'll turn my attention for the remaining minutes of my comments to speak about the things that may guide us in our reflections on faithfulness and flourishing in our MedTech world. The first of these theological considerations is rediscovering a robust doctrine of creation. Perhaps for some this was never lost, and to be clear, some theological and ecclesial traditions retained a very robust moral theology of creation. But for those of us who come from Protestant traditions, and particularly those of us who are evangelicals, generational approaches to science that drunk deeply from the Baconian well conceived of science as the mastery of nature in both knowing and controlling of the natural world for the relief of the human condition. Such an approach has resulted, and I'm going to be clear here, in a reductionistic view of the world. Such views have resulted in a reductionistic view of the world, not seeking to understand creation as an act of awe and wonder, but as a form of what has been referred to as bare life. Bare life, as developed by the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, is understood as a kind of life, a bios, or bios, a biological existence devoid of any value or context. It's stripped of a zoe, the kind of social and political life that gives it meaning. It provides context to the life. Bare life, by contrast, this bios kind of life, when applied to humanity, is dehumanizing. It's the dehumanization of the human. When applied to the natural world, it's the emptying of creation to be a mere natural resource, a commodity for instrumental use. More than a secular reenchantment of nature or some kind of worship of Mother Earth, a theological doctrine of creation, by way of contrast, affirms that creation is good. Though fallen and corrupted by the ravaging effects of the fall and sin, the creation still remains good, possesses intrinsic value. It's not merely instrumental. As Scripture declares, creation had value before humans were ever on the scene. To be sure, everything is declared very good, tov meod in the Hebrew, once humans are created, but creation had its value, tov. It was declared good before human creation. To affirm the goodness of creation is not to suggest that it is more important than humans. It's not to suggest that creation cannot in any way be used in the service of human beings. But as quoted by Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si, quote, that where other beings, other creatures are concerned, we can speak of a priority of being over that of being useful. I had a lengthy quote and a discussion here on Martin Luther to offer Protestant kind of reaffirmation of that. I'll skip that in the interest of time. In the evolving emergence of virtual and augmented realities, in the context of research in the fundamental organic building blocks of life, in synthetic biology, pursuit of development of artificial life, and the increasing attention to the nanoscale, a Christian Hippocratic engagement in these domains begins with a robust doctrine of creation and at the affirmation that it was good. It may be fallen, it may be corrupted, but it still has value. That value is not exclusively in its usefulness, its instrumental usefulness to us, and it is certainly not only to be seen as a mere natural commodity for our exploitation. Even as we recognize the vocational calling of the cultural mandate that Keith Plummer mentioned on Thursday evening, we need to recognize that creation still has a prior value before it is useful to us. We could go on to talk about the importance, likewise, of perceiving creation through the lens of both gift and givenness, but again, I'm going to move on. Second, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here as well, because I think this is an area that Christian bioethics has done particularly well with, and that's on the imago doctrine, something that Jason Thacker unpacked a bit more for us yesterday. The imago doctrine, human dignity, the value of each individual human life continues to be a hallmark of Christian Hippocratic engagement. However, I would be remiss in reframing the future of health and a discussion of faithfulness and flourishing without least acknowledging that our commitment to the unique value and special dignity that accompanies all human life is central. A value and dignity that is rooted in the Christian tradition and our belief that all human beings, I'm going to say that again, all human beings are created in the image of God. Full stop. Not with respect to any consideration of age, developmental stage, with respect to gender, with respect to race, capability, accomplishment, status, wealth, potential for contribution. All human beings, full stop, are created in the image of God and are loved by and valued by the Creator. Again, I don't need to rehash this. I merely wish to underscore that access for the marginalized, hospitality, care for the vulnerable were historic practices that emerged from these convictions, and we've somewhat drifted away from them. The provision and care, hospitable welcome to the infirm, the disabled, those who struggle with mental illness, chronic suffering, need to be reclaimed. These need to be championed in a Christian engagement for the future of health. Not merely the things that attend to a social commitment to protecting life, as important as that is. Affirming the value of human life means we should be committed to human life that flourishes and helping that life flourish. Not merely the well, not merely the able-bodied, not merely those who can afford the best technology in medical care. Staying in the doctrinal domain of theological anthropology, we need to continue to cultivate a much more robust understanding of what it means to be human. Beyond this imago doctrine, here I propose 4 core theological concepts related to our anthropology that need much more development, and I wager can offer us significant opportunities in the engagement of faithfulness and flourishing in our MedTech world. The first of these is the relational nature of our humanity. To be sure, as a theologian, I understand and recognize that many who discuss the imago doctrine already want to talk about that in the context of the imago doctrine. I'm just going to sidestep that because I know that there are differences of opinion in that regard. Regardless of whether one sees relationality as the image of God, what should be clear to all of us is that relationality is a fundamental aspect of our being. In Genesis 2, there is one thing in all of God's good creation that is not good, lo tov, and that's man is alone. The man is alone, except he's not alone, right? He's in a pristine relationship with creation. He's in a pristine relationship with God, and yet that was not sufficient for the conditions for his existence as a human being. Well, that's very interesting. Humans are made as relational beings. We are created in and for and through relationships. Now, I should note here, because this comes up in the context of the imago, even with respect to the relational definition, that this is not with reference to our capacity to respond, okay? Just because a human life may not to be able to reciprocate in any ways we might acknowledge as relationship back, that life has always been loved by God and is created in a loving relationship with his or her creator. Developments of the MedTech world that diminish our capacity for relationships fundamentally diminish the conditions for our faithfulness and flourishing in this MedTech world. The second of these four core areas of theological anthropology that I think we need more work in. Humans are complex bodily beings, embodiment. We are physical creatures. Whatever more we may be in terms of our spiritual and rational natures, we are nothing less than our physical reality. Through we have the complexities of sin and suffering, disease and disability, the degradation of the body through the hardships of life. Nonetheless, our bodies are ourselves. Okay? We are not reducible to our bodies, as if the material is all there is. However, the Christian confession of bodily resurrection affirms that our bodies are an essential part of our ultimate true human nature. To deny our bodies the significance of our bodily nature, to suggest the body as a canvas, a blank canvas, an original prosthetic, a meat prison, is to hold to a position that is incompatible with the Christian faith. That way goes Gnosticism. Developments of the MedTech world that question or diminish the value of our bodies diminish our understanding of what it means to be human, and they diminish the conditions for faithfulness and flourishing in a MedTech world. Of course, an overemphasis on the body as the reducible locus of the individual in a materialist paradigm likewise diminishes the complex nature of our beings. The conditions, therefore, that we can begin to develop faithfulness and flourishing. We are holistic beings. The care of holistic beings requires the care not of an anticipatory corpse, but of whole persons, complex, bio, psycho, social, spiritual beings. And that is why a shift to offering cures without care in medicine is so deeply problematic, because it no longer treats the patient as person, but rather the patient as a diseased body. Taken in combination with previous theological concept of relationality, bodily presence, embodied relationality is an explicit expression of our affirmation that presence and proximity are fundamental human ways to relate to one another. I would venture this is the true reason why we are seeing that the virtual is not a complete surrogate for being together in the real. The third of the four concepts in theological anthropology we need to explore further: finitude. In some ways, a correlate of our embodiment, we were created with limits, a point that Kristen Collier mentioned in her talk. As Augustine notes, we are neither beasts nor gods. Humans were created as good and very good, but still finite, contingent beings. While brokenness and frailty, disease and suffering and death are all consequences of sin and the fall, the mere presence of limits for human existence is not itself among them. It is not a consequence of the fall. Human limitation, more specifically human finitude, is an essential aspect of our createdness and therefore of being human. In our created goodness, humans were not limitless gods. We were bounded beings. Finitude reminds us that while humans were created in the image of God, we are not God. In tandem with embodiment, these two concepts point to the givenness of human life. This has profound implications. Much more could be developed here and should, but again, I'm going to move on. To dismiss or diminish human finitude as a fundamental aspect of our being human is to diminish the conditions of faithfulness and flourishing in this MedTech world. To these three concepts, we add the fourth: contingency and vulnerability. Contingency could also be understood as a correlate of finitude, but I mention it here specifically with vulnerability in mind. Given the dominating emphasis on autonomy in the MedTech world, dependency is seen as an ultimate evil, being perceived as a burden, an irredeemable wrong to effect upon others. And this attitude denies something important about the vulnerable nature of our existence, our continued dependence upon the Creator, not just for our initial creation, but for our continued life. To be vulnerable and dependent is not a failure of person or personhood. It's not a diminishment of life that should result in the perceived loss of dignity. Rather, being contingent beings as dependent upon our Creator helps us to reaffirm a reality that we state in the Nicene Creed, recognizing that the Lord is the giver of life, the Lord and giver of life. Contingency, therefore, reaffirms that life is and continues to be a gift. It is His alone to give, it is His alone to take. Blessed be the name of the Lord. To believe that we can deny our contingency, to somehow overcome it, to secure ourselves from our vulnerable state, is to make the same blunder as the folks in Genesis 11. They sought to make a name for themselves and not to be scattered all over the earth through the work of their hands. An act of hubris, thinking they could go it alone without God for their own glory and believing they could secure their own protection. Some attention has been given to this topic through the work of Andrew Sloan, as well as to Henk ten Have. Again, more could be done here. Each of these four concepts in theological anthropology, relationality, embodiment, finitude, and vulnerability, speak to core aspects of what it means to be and remain human. Again, to diminish or to dismiss these concepts is to diminish the conditions for faithfulness and human flourishing in a MedTech world. So we've affirmed the importance of cultural diagnosis and the knowing of the times. We've identified the importance of a Christian affirmation of the goodness of creation, the importance of a robust theological anthropology. The last of the theological areas that I'll mention is Christian eschatology and our eschatological hope. Here I know we're likely going to have substantive disagreements amongst us, given all of the various controversies and the many different theological views regarding the end and last things. Don't worry, my interest here isn't to actually walk through any of those, but rather to point us to the things that pull us together, that unite us as Christians in our one hope, after all. One faith, one hope. The trajectory of the MedTech world, as expressed in the trends we mentioned earlier, medicalization, technological solutionism, on to the more explicit beliefs of transhumanism, posthumanism, H+, that are advocated by proponents of such movements, suggest to us the importance to identify and locate technology vis-a-vis our hope for human futures, and how those relate to our eschatological future, and the conditions necessary for and rationale for a truly human future this side of eternity. To not properly locate the source of our hope will lead us to both confusion and disappointment. The temptation to idolatry, as we just finished exploring, is there. And it will lead us to all sorts of dehumanizing and destructive ends, from intolerance of the undesirable to the elimination of the imperfect in the technological drive for perfection. Humans as finite, embodied, vulnerable creatures have no place in such a future. And thus, all the more reason to be clear for what do we hope. That's all I'm going to say on that. So how might we operationalize these? Here I return us back to the conversation that Keith Plummer began with us on Thursday evening, back to a conversation on practice and the cultivation of virtue. So in our few last minutes here. Just going to point us to a few virtues and the ways in which these might inform and help us to reframe the future of health. In the instant gratification of digital access and the fulfillment of our consumer desires through same-day delivery, the practice of patience, our first virtue, is a lost art. Always-on connected existence moves hand in hand with breeding impatience. It works against it. It militates against patience. Cultivating patience will require us to engage in countercultural activities. It marks the quality of seeing the importance of the detours in life, that recognizing that the most efficient way forward is not necessarily the best way forward. In the world of education, this is fundamentally clear. Yes, we can use these technologies to get the easy answer, but that doesn't make us more wise. Yes, we can help it to perform better on test scores or to submit papers that you didn't really write. You will get the grade, but you didn't learn anything. There is a difference between access and formation. Being human in a way that flourishes and fulfills a faithfulness requires cultivation and time. It's why Aristotle envisioned arete, his word virtue, as the result of cultivation, much like an athlete trains their body for competition. It's why Aquinas, in his Christian reinterpretation of Aristotle, took it a step further and discusses it in the Latin, the word habitus. It's a habit. It's the work of habituation. Patience helps us to recognize that moving fast is not necessarily moving better, and that sometimes the things most valuable in life will take us longer. There is no shortcut in the cultivation of wisdom, in the way that leads to flourishing, in the way that leads to life. The next two, I'm going to just move quickly because I spoke about these a few years ago at one of our conferences, and so that's a plug to use the center's website and access some of the past resources. But these are the virtues of contentment and humility as a practice of the ethics of restraint. The ethics of restraint was something that Jacques Ellul began to write about a bit in his later writings. And I think it's something that is worthy of more sustained development. Some articles, particularly in the New Atlantis, have been written on that in recent years, and I would encourage you to look at that a bit more. By contentment, I don't mean to signal some kind of fatalism or abandonment of hope, so don't hear me as saying that. Rather, I want us to see that there is neither an obligation to adopt new technologies as such, nor is the pursuit of perfection itself a noble pursuit. As finite, embodied, contingent human beings, we are vulnerable creatures dependent on our Creator. To exercise contentment, therefore, is an exercise of the realization that we are not gods. Okay? It doesn't mean that we should not be about the business of relieving suffering. That is not at all what I'm saying. But that in our pursuit of the relief of suffering, we need to remember that there are fundamental aspects of being human. While we need not be content with suffering and disease, we must learn contentment in the context of the givenness of our finitude. Humility likewise helps us to avoid the presumption that we can go it alone, that we don't need God. Humility helps us to reaffirm practices of self-examination, to know ourselves properly. In a Christian frame, it also helps us to remember that others should be considered before ourselves. Humility, while helping us to have a proper understanding of ourselves, locates us properly in our relationship and obligation to the other. Humility reminds us that we are neither the lords of the universe nor the center of all things. With respect to the relational nature in our creation in the image of God, we could go a step further and talk about the virtue that attends to hospitality. There has been some excellent work in this, particularly in the biblical scholarship, biblical studies literature. One of our faculty here at TEDS has recently written a book on this from a New Testament perspective. Strongly encourage that. Also literature in disability ethics and disability ministry but it hasn't been well developed from my assessment in the broader sweep of Christian bioethics. Agneta Sutton has been one of the few exceptions, and her use of the phrase unconditional welcome has continued to reverberate with me, an expression of hospitality that she directs specifically to early human life. I think this notion, this idea, this concept of unconditional welcome is one that we can deeply mine from a Christian perspective. Furthermore, given the contemporary context in which we find ourselves, with all of the currents and attendant competing values of the MedTech world, we need to learn how to cultivate once again the virtue of courage. Again, I spoke about this a few years ago, so I won't dig into this much, but just a few comments. Whether or not one embraces Rod Dreher's Benedict option of cultural engagement, the practices and virtues that will foster faithfulness and flourishing likely will require us to become rather countercultural. Choosing to exercise restraint, to not partake in some of the aspects of our MedTech world are going to place us on the margins. We're going to become outliers if we aren't already. To paraphrase the Wendell Berry quote, and I had this in my notes before you brought it up, Dr. Collier, so thank you for mentioning this. But if we choose to live as people who wish to live as creatures, this is my paraphrase, that will take courage to live among a world of people who wish to live as machines. We could also point to the importance of cultivating wisdom, another virtue central to the Aristotelian model of virtue thinking, and the ways in which the theological tradition has embraced that through the ideas of the Christian life of the mind, something that is sorely needed some years after Mark Knoll's Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, and yet we're still here. But I'm going to bring this to an end. I mentioned earlier Edmund Pellegrino, and I can think of no other fitting person to end by quoting in a reflection about virtues. Pellegrino, as you may know, wrote 2 volumes and a number of essays, but 2 volumes on virtue. The first was just on just virtues in general. The second was the Christian virtues in medical practice, where he specifically unpacks the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love in the context of medicine. And I think some of his comments are applicable as we think about reframing the future of health. Speaking of the virtue of hope, I'll start with faith. Speaking of the virtue of faith, he comments, quote, "The temptation to question, doubt, and despair is ever present. Paradoxically, while misfortune challenges faith, it is only faith that can give hope and meaning to human suffering and dying. Faith is the spiritual compass we need in the face of the moral and ethical dilemmas of modern medical practice," he says. Faith entails a commitment to the source of morality beyond humankind, a source in sacred scripture, tradition, the teachings of the church, and for him, its official magisterium. Regarding the virtue of hope, hope stands as the means between presumption and despair that we've talked about throughout this time. Presumption unwisely, according to Pellegrino, underestimates the impediments between us and the good we desire. Despair, on the other hand, is the abandonment of our conviction that the obstacles might or could ever be overcome. Hope is the thing that allows us to move forward. Regarding the supreme theological virtue of love, the ordering principle which refers to the love of God and the love of the other. Pellegrino begins by describing the ethical commitment to the welfare of the sick, that this is a fundamental aspect of Hippocratic medicine. He then goes on to unpack the transformative nature of the Christian theological virtue of love, stating, "Thus charity respects the autonomy of a patient in a way different than autonomy is respected in purely naturally conceived formulation of this principle. Charity cannot be possessive, self-congratulating, or self-righteous." He goes on to talk about the obligation for the care of human beings, for patients as persons, that derives from this love, noting the way that the modern orientation of care has taken on a, quote, "radical sense to refer to the eradication of the cause of an illness or disease," end quote. He states with horror, it has become possible to cure without caring. He concludes, this is incompatible with a charity-based ethic rooted in the Christian virtue of love. Now, these three things remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. May these lessons guide us as we seek to foster faithfulness and flourishing in our MedTech world, as we continue the work of cultural diagnosis, the task of learning and exploring the implications of our Christian faith, specifically in the context of the goodness of creation, the aspects of theological anthropology, of relationality, of embodiment, of finitude, of vulnerability, as we properly locate our eschatological hopes. And as we look to practice the attendant virtues that emerge from these commitments, the virtues of patience, the virtues of contentment, humility, hospitality, courage, and wisdom. And all of these done in the context and guidance of faith, hope, and love. May we learn from these things as we reframe the future of health in the work we have before us in Christian bioethics. Thank you.